Good morning and happy Friday, everyone. My name is Holly McPhail. I am a communications and strategy consultant with Florida After School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Out of School Time Evaluation and Assessment Tools. We definitely want to invite you, if you have a camera, to come on camera and say hi to our team, and I will let you know that we are recording. If you have questions while we're going through the session, feel free to drop them in the chat and we will do our best to respond in real time and then circle back at the end and answer any of those questions out loud. With that said, hi WFSU team, we see you. It's nice to see you guys again. With that, I will turn it over to our Executive Director, Miss Lily Murphy.
Well, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead. We're going to get started because we're kind of a small group. I know if a couple other folks are going to join in a little bit, but feel free, as you have questions, to go ahead and come off mute. We can kind of make this a little bit more of an informal conversation, but we'll still go through a lot of the content that we have here for you today, and feel free to ask questions as you have them. So that being said, we're here today to talk about out of school time evaluation and assessment tools. And so just to kind of kick us off, I love to start with, I guess I should introduce myself, right? So for those of you who may not know me, although I know 3 of the 4 boxes on the screen, we've worked with you all before, but I'm Lily Murphy and I'm the Executive Director here at Florida After School. I've been in this role now for, I don't know, it's been more than 1 year, I can tell you that. It's been like maybe 3 years, coming up on 3 years.
Celebrating 2 years next month.
Oh, it's only been 2 years?
Lily.
Okay, it feels like it's been like 5, but it's only been 2. But before this, I actually supported the 21st Century statewide technical assistance team, which, if you're not familiar with, is a federally funded out of school time initiative, as well as working across many other state initiatives in Florida. So I've done a couple of different kind of statewide implementations. So I'm very glad to be here with Florida After School leading this work. It's a close passion of mine. And I love to share, folks, that in reality, my first job ever was running an after school program way back in the day, many years ago. So all of that to say a little bit about Florida After School. I won't read you our vision and our mission, but they're up here for y'all to look at. But really what we do is we work to promote quality out of school time programs, best practices for existing programs, and supporting those existing programs and providers with ongoing training and technical assistance. We advocate for policies that support the expansion of funding, as well as an increase in resources potentially for existing programs. And we also work to educate the general public and our stakeholders as to why is this work so important and so critical. We then also collaborate with public and private partners to share out this information, both at a local level in our state and also on a national level. We're partnering with some entities to make sure that the information we're sharing is the most up-to-date and current, as well as we're really meeting those provider needs, right? When we think about partnership on that continuum and that spectrum. And then we work to engage those direct service providers to ensure that our efforts are representing their needs and meeting the needs, not just of the providers, but of the youth that they're working with and of the families as well. So just a little bit about us. And so I'd love to, if you can, go ahead and do a quick introduction, just a little fun activity for us. In the chat, if you could please put your name, what organization you're with, and your favorite cereal. I figured since it's early in the morning, some people might be eating their cereal still, I'm sure. And let me just click on the chat. Ooh, I see a Cinnamon Toast Crunch in the chat. Very exciting. 2 Cinnamon Toast Crunches. Oh, love it.
Ready?
So we've seen a couple. I'm gonna say I haven't seen two of the same ones so far. Let's see. We've got some folks here. We've got Honey Nut Cheerios. We've got a Frosted Flakes, a classic. Granola, very healthy option. Pops, Chex, another Captain Crunch. Captain Crunch is in the lead. Apple Jacks with ice cold milk. I think ice cold milk is very important for cereal. And then we've got oatmeal with blueberries, not a cereal. Okay. I can support that. Well, thank you all for those of you who responded. I will just share my favorite cereal these days is Crave. If you don't know Crave, I suggest looking into Crave. It's kind of like a little chocolate filled square. But I do like a good dessert for breakfast, if you will.
But we got to just doing a flip flop in the system.
So with that, thank you all for participating in that. And we're gonna go ahead and kind of jump right into our agenda. So we're gonna start out by doing some Lucky Charms. Okay, I support Lucky Charms. It's my daughter's favorite. We're gonna go ahead and start off with our agenda. We're gonna talk about an introduction to out of school time program assessments. Then if you're not familiar with a logic model, we are going to go over like a high level overview of what a logic model is, as well as talk about some curriculum selection and go over some of those common domains in that space. And then we're going to dive into, and where I hope we spend the bulk of our time and really hear from you all, is in these assessment components. And then at the end, we will have some time to answer questions at the very end as well. So right off the bat, I have to tell you all that we are going to start off with some Mythbuster. And if you remember the show Mythbusters, this is a little bit like that. But if you were here because you're trying to figure out what is the one perfect assessment tool for your out of school time program, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that is a myth. There is no singular tool that exists, right? That is the perfect assessment tool for your program. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a good one out there. There's just not one that is a one size fit all. And I will also then say that we are going to talk about this one tool that allows you to measure every single outcome, every single thing that your program does. And unfortunately, that also does not exist, right? So these are some common myths when we talk about assessment in the out of school time space, that oftentimes we're searching for this one solution that will meet all of our needs. And the reality is it doesn't exist. And why doesn't it exist? And so I just want to pause for a second. And I invite you all to unmute, but why do you think that these don't exist? Not everyone at the same time.
You're serving different populations, so it might be difficult to find one tool that applies to different ages, different interests, different, I guess, program designs would be my thought.
Absolutely. And then someone in the chat said so many facets and layers within one singular program. And I would say that both of these are really accurate and contribute to the why, right? If I tell you, and I'll tell you why I think it is. And I think it's because while after school and summer programs are essential, right? They're not typically the priority of anyone, right? So when we talk about, and I say anyone, but like I'm talking about maybe those people who fund things, right? So when we look at our school day system, there are tons of assessments out there for the school day programs for K through 12, right? We know that our public schools, they participate in formative assessments all throughout the year. We collect school grades on students in that space. But after school doesn't have those same kind of resources typically that the school day would have, right? And when we talk about, who drives this kind of market, oftentimes what we see with assessments is that they're typically attached to a curriculum or a curriculum provider. And so when we look at, this concept of, is there an assessment? There are tons of assessments. Were they specifically designed for the out of school time space? Maybe, maybe not. And are they the best fit for you all operating in the space? the answer is there's probably not one that fits all programs across the board, because no two programs are alike in this space. And I think that's really where the out of school time providers are unique and differ from, and I'm going to compare it to the school day, but differ from the school day when we think of, you know, the school day is teaching youth to a certain standard, to a certain goal, and that goal is pretty consistent across grade levels and across schools from one county to another. So when we think about, you know, measuring that impact, it's really hard when you may have an out of school time provider who focuses on, you know, academic supports, right? Where you might have one that focuses on the arts. And how do you compare apples to oranges? So now that we know there's not necessarily, you know, and so I'm sorry to burst the bubble. If that is why you signed up for my webinar, please stay tuned. There are solutions out there. It's just not, it might not be a one-stop shop. So when we look at, I forgot I can't click my arrow, sorry. So what do we know about the field, right? So what does our research shows us? And there is a researcher out of California. Her name is Dr. Deborah Vandell, and she has spent the last 30 years of her career researching out of school time programs, specifically the impact that after school programs have on youth. And across these 30 years, they have conducted, her and her team have conducted individual research studies. They have done meta-analysis studies, and even published reports in the National Academy of Science. And collectively, what they have found is that after school programs do positively impact academic, social, and behavioral outcomes, both with short-term and long-term benefits. But their research shows that this only happens when certain conditions are met. And those conditions include program quality, the program attendance or dosage, right? How frequently are youth participating in these programs? And so it's really important that when we talk about what is high quality program and how do we prove, right, that our programs are high quality, or that we're having the intended outcome or measure that we're hoping that we're achieving through our activities, that we really look and take a second to consider what is high quality and what are those elements of high quality programs. And so here at Florida After School, we've kind of taken this research done by Dr. Vandell and looked at the standards, right, the quality standards for out of school time instruction, and looked at what are those measures, those indicators that point towards high quality. And we know that it comes down to active learning, lower child to teacher ratios, having differentiated instruction opportunities, and high quality instruction, blending academics with learning and engaging activities, encouraging and supporting high attendance, so participation, right? Making sure your program duration is accessible to the community, parental involvement, and then effective evaluations. And so when we look at these, I'm not going to spend time going over each of these components individually, but when we think of high quality programs that are successful, that kind of move the needle for outcomes, typically are having some of these elements, if not all of these elements, present in their program. So we're going to go ahead and jump into logic models, and why do we start with logic models? And so typically a logic model is a tool that organizations use for planning and communicating and evaluating their program or intervention, right? So they represent a relationship between what you're doing and what you're hoping to achieve through your actions. How do you develop a logic model? Well, there's not really necessarily a right or wrong place to start, but it starts with taking a look at what is it that you currently are doing in your programs and what are your hopes and your goals. And so it's really important that you all, and I don't need an answer out loud, but take a second to ask yourself, why? What is your why? Why is it that you are doing the work that you do? What is your intended, why and what is your intended outcome? What are you hoping to achieve by XYZ? Excuse me. And so why are logic models necessary? And we're going to take a look at a logic model, and I'm going to walk you through some of those different components. But essentially, we use logic models to give us a clear vision of our goals, and then think about what it is that we need to achieve them and how we need to achieve them. And so there are some key components of a logic model. When we talk through what does it actually look like, we're really looking for what are our inputs, right? What are resources that go into our program or our intervention? What are some activities that we're doing, right? Or sometimes those can oftentimes be interchangeable with your outputs. What are the tangible results of these activities? And then looking at your outcomes, right? So when we talk about outcomes, taking a look at what is our program's desired outcome, right? Is it a short-term goal? Is it a long-term goal? Is it a short-term goal that will benefit a long-term goal? And then making sure that we have those expectations kind of clearly defined. And then we take a look at what are some of those assumptions or contextual factors all throughout the concept of a logic model. So where are we making assumptions about maybe what's available, or what are some external factors that play into the success of what we're trying to do? And all throughout this process, we're going to evaluate. And so when we look at logic models, and this is like a very simple diagram, and it actually maybe simple maybe isn't the right word. It's not a completed logic model. It's a kind of a how logic model. But when we look at these inputs and outputs and outcomes, it's really important to note that they kind of feed into one another, right? So when we talk about our inputs, what are we investing, right? So are we talking about staff, time, money, volunteers, materials, equipment, technology, the what that goes into the output, right? So what are we doing? What is our activity? Are we doing a workshop? Are we conducting a lesson? Are we having a session or a project-based activity with who we want to reach, right? So making sure that our audience in this space is the right audience. And then taking a look at those outcomes. So those short-term outcomes, those medium or like mid-range outcomes, and then your ultimate impact or kind of your long-term outcome. And then we want to look at what are those factors that play into this space. But I think what's really important to note here and why we kind of start with this is the evaluation piece at the bottom. So during this entire process, right, we kind of really quickly walk through what a logic model was. We should be looking at how do we evaluate if what we're doing is successful? How do we know that we are putting in the right inputs with the right outputs to ensure that the outcomes we're trying to achieve are successful, right? So I do have a question in the chat, so I'm just gonna go ahead and
It's just me, Lily. It's not a question. It was just a comment. Reiterating what you're saying. Keep going.
Okay. So so with the why, right? So when we look at evaluation, it's really important that as we're talking through what are our inputs that we have available or inputs we need to acquire, we're thinking, okay, so how do we evaluate in every step of this process if what we're doing is successful, right? And it starts with this concept of assessment and evaluation, but it also starts with this concept of designing a program that will lead to those outcomes. So I want to talk about just really briefly, when we talk about activities or curriculum selection, there's typically two fields, right, where we see okay, there's really three. We'll talk about the third one. There's two on the slide for the purposes of this conversation. When we look at curriculum selection, we're really talking about oftentimes you hear the term research-based or evidence-based, right? And so sometimes research-based is sometimes called evidence-informed or research-informed curriculum, but it's really based on research that is available, right? So and I use the term research because it is different than evidence-based. When we look at evidence-based, we're typically referring to curricula or activities or practices that have been tested and have been proven to show a positive outcome, right? And that's, I think, the key difference between research-based and evidence-based. And so I did say there's a third, right? And the third is, when we talk about the third, what if they're neither of these two? Right? So you have a curriculum, maybe you built it yourself. You have not invested in a research study, right? Our funds are limited in this space. We did not invest in a research study. We did not invest in evidence-based practices over the course of many years because we started, right? that does not mean that what you're doing is not effective, right? So I just want to kind of point that out right at the beginning. There's this other category. So if you're looking for a curriculum or you've built your own, I don't want you to feel discouraged because it doesn't fall into these two categories, right? But these are typically terms that we often see when we're looking at, even when you're looking at buying a curriculum, right? So when we've talked about, like, I'm sure some of us have shopped for curriculums before, like, quick show of hands, anybody shopped for a curriculum? How many times have we heard these buzzwords of research-based, research-informed, or evidence-based? And it's what folks who are selling curriculums tend to lead with, right? Because they have the support that backs what they're saying for their curriculum, their intervention, their best practice, whatever it is that they're selling us. Now, I think that's great. Oftentimes, what we know is that those options tend to be more costly for programs. Why? Because someone at some point in the continuum invested lots and lots of money to prove that what their intervention was successful, or that there is research to support that they're doing what they're doing. So when we think of these two concepts, as we go through the next couple of slides, I just kind of want to keep these in the back of your mind as we move forward, because they tie into how we do assessments. And I do want to highlight just really quickly, because I wouldn't be doing you all a service if I didn't really quickly explain what evidence-based. When we talk about evidence-based, it's probably the harder of the two, right, between research and evidence-based to look at, because there are different tiers in the evidence-based world, right? So there's a resource at the end of the slide that will kind of show you. There's a clearing warehouse where all of this information gets published. But evidence-based curricula is based upon scientific evidence, right? That uses rational support and demonstrates a statistically significant effect on student improvement on that outcome. So when we look at those evidence-based, they're typically categorized into 4 tiers, right? And those 4 tiers are it's really tiers 1, 2, and 3, and then no evidence. And I like to go ahead and start by just saying that, and I put it in here because sometimes we think it might be backwards, but tier 1 is the stronger tier. So when you are looking at, if you are looking at an evidence-based curriculum and you really want to see, is this effective? You're looking for it to have that tier 1 designation, which means there is a lot of evidence. There's really strong evidence that shows that that intervention is effective towards moving the needle on that outcome, right? And so tier 2 is moderate evidence, which means there's some out there. And tier 3 is promising evidence. And so there's less evidence out there. It might not be as like widely tested or proven, right? There's not a whole lot of evidence, but it's showing some promise in those initial stages of testing, right? And then the last one is there's no evidence. So it's either there's no evidence aligned to the intervention or practice, or there's mixed evidence, which means there's contradicting evidence, right? In some cases it was effective, in some cases it was not effective. It's not statistically significant. So I take us to this place of, so we know this information, right? About, okay, we have research-based, we have evidence-based. How do we now use this to choose a curriculum, right? So there are a few other things that we want to consider when looking at all the various curriculums that exist out there. And they include things like, what's your preferred teaching method, right? And I give the example of, are you someone who needs the teacher's guide to have a very detailed explanation of how you do all the activities and why? Are you someone who can order a curriculum kit, and pick up and implement, kind of off the cuff? What is your preferred teaching method? Do you prefer hands-on, lecture-based? What does that look like? What are your personal preferences, or your staff's personal preferences in some cases? As we look at curriculum, what are your learning styles, right? When we talk about what are your students' learning styles, we're talking about, do they learn better with hands-on activities? Is it a lecture format, auditory, visual learners? What is that learning style that they prefer? And I would add to this that we're also looking at how is it different, right? Because typically in an out of school time space, we're not trying to mirror what the school day is doing, right? We're typically a safe and different space for fun and engaging hands-on learning. And so that's a really important concept to look at when you're choosing a curriculum. It's also important to know, what are your goals for the program, right? So start with your organization's logic model if you have one, right? What are those outcomes you're trying to achieve overall long-term? Is the curriculum relevant to what it is that you all are doing? Is it developmentally appropriate, right? So when we look at curriculums, I think it's great. There's lots of them out there. Some will say, yeah, we're good for all ages. We can be adapted for all ages. But it's really important to look at that content and say, is this really true? Can we truly adapt this curriculum for all ages? So if you run a program that serves kindergarten through middle school, is this one curriculum solution going to be okay for everyone to use? And then also look at their flexibility for that curriculum, right? How flexible is it as and I use flexibility, and it ties a little bit to cost too, but think about your individual programs and the work that you all are doing. You all know your budgets better than anyone, right? We know that oftentimes in the out of school time space, we reuse things from one year to another. Is the curriculum flexible enough to allow you to do that? Is it flexible enough to allow you to pause on the curriculum because you have the students' interests have shifted now? So let's say you buy a STEM curriculum and it's a STEM curriculum on environmental sciences. And we all know, well, I'm not sure if all of us live in Florida, but for those of us who do live in Florida, we know we're surrounded by water for the most part. And what if our students' interest shifts in environmental sciences and they're really looking at the marine aspect of things? Can that curriculum shift with us? Is there a way for it to pause, to allow for that flexibility to take an exploratory break from the curriculum? Or is it so rigorous and so regimented that we have to keep going in order to meet the intended outcome, right? That's really important to consider when we're looking at this space. Also look at do they have an evaluation component that they offer built in with the curriculum, right? That kind of like that assessment piece, that little E for evaluation in this space. You know, if you buy, let's say, and I'm going to use very simple examples for the purposes of our conversation today, but you buy a literacy curriculum, right? A language arts curriculum to use in your program. Does it come with a language arts assessment to test to see if the curriculum you're using is effective? That's a really simple way to evaluate whether or not the intervention being delivered is effective. And then what does that cost for that curriculum? So I alluded to sometimes we recycle things from year to year. We like to buy things that can be reused. What does that cost look like? Are you buying a curriculum that every year you're having to purchase hundreds upon thousands of dollars to renew, to be able to continue to use the existing curriculum? So that's just something to think about when we're looking at choosing curriculums. In addition to what we kind of started with, which is, you know, are they research-based, are they evidence-based, or other, right? So typically here, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on these domains, but I like to point out that in this space, we typically operate in these 6 domains, right? We have literacy interventions or program or activities or curriculum. We typically see STEM grouped together. Sometimes we see mathematics as separate. Most of the time it's kind of grouped into the STEM environment. We also have arts and creativity, right? And so that can include things like your music programs, your dance programs, your I was like, what is it? Like art camps where kids are painting and creating visual, like manual arts. We oftentimes see physical fitness and physical development. Oftentimes that can include things like their general health and nutrition and not just their ability to do push-ups, right? So when we talk about fitness and physical development, it's the whole person. We see things in terms of workforce development, right? We're talking about college and career readiness, helping youth develop the technical skills that they need to enter the workplace or the skills that they need to move on to higher education. And then we're looking at this resiliency and well-being, right? And so these are oftentimes referred to as the social skills, self-awareness, self-control, and other interpersonal skills. They're oftentimes called like the 21st century skill set. And so these are the common domains that we see curriculums talk about, that we operate in. And so it's really important to kind of think about these as we continue on. And so what happens, right, if we can't find a curriculum, we can't afford a curriculum, or maybe we started a program and we've been kind of doing our own activities and lessons and our own curriculum for the last 3 or 4 years. And you're like, well, I guess I built a curriculum. You're sitting here on this call with me and you're like, well, I guess I did this. I have a curriculum. It's just not something we purchased, right? or you're thinking of starting a program and you know, right, that our dollars are tight and we are in the space of, we've invested them in, you know, the facilities, the staff for the youth, and we are now looking at how do we afford a curriculum, right? There are some tips for designing your own curriculum. So before I jump into these, I do want to say that there are lots of free curriculums out there, right? That are vetted and tested, that come with backing and support. And so if you're in that space, don't feel like you have to build your own, right? It's different if you are passionate and you've designed your own, it's something you've already been doing or something you want to do, but it's not something that's necessary if you can't afford to buy a curriculum, because there are lots of free resources out there for out of school time providers on how to do activities around those domains that we just looked at, that really allow for us to be able to measure some outcomes. And we're going to get to the how around measuring outcomes in just a minute. So when we talk about, you know, tips for designing your own curriculum, we really want to seek out resources. So it's really important to look for curriculums in the similar domain, look for activities in a look for activities in a similar domain, make sure that they're aligning with your standards. You want them to have, you know, is it a way when you're designing your curriculum that you're going to be able to measure those learning gains, right? Do we have clear expectations that align with standards that then allow us to measure a learning gain? Are we consistent in our programming? We want to make sure that you're flexible, right? So think about the after school space and what we know happens, right? The reality is, you know, sometimes you think you're going to have 5 folks show up to work that day and you may have 4, right? So we need curriculums that allow us to be flexible and to adapt our needs, right? So a curriculum that says you can't do this activity with more than 5 students might not be the most flexible curriculum for us. And really thinking through those limitations. Can it be small group, large group as you're designing your curriculum opportunities? And then we also want to look at identifying your local needs as well as your group needs. So take a look at what is it that your students are needing? What is it that the communities need, right? So does it make sense to have an academic remediation type program or academic support program in a community where all the students are getting straight A's, right? Look at what those needs are. Do they have other needs that you could be meeting? And then do your own research, right? So do your own research to find what's available out there and what programs exist to support you. And I will say one great resource for free curriculum that is out there is WFSU with PBS Kids. Anyone can set up an account. You can access various lesson plans and use their materials. And typically they require things that are little to no cost, right? They'll give you a materials list as well as how to implement that activity. And there are other resources out there as well. Another one that we also recommend, that we would recommend is Mizzen Education. And they're actually an app that you can download on your, and Holly, I'm gonna ask if you can find the link and drop it in the chat. Thank you. That allows providers to look at hundreds of lessons that have been vetted from various curriculum providers nationally that give you 3 or 4 lessons from a provider that allow you to implement around one of those domains. And they're typically geared towards certain age ranges. It's all free. It's on your phone. You can download it. You can email it to yourself. You can print it. It comes with, you know, all of the items that you would need to be able to complete that activity. And shameless plug, Mizzen will be joining us for a webinar at the end of the month. So if it's something you're interested in learning more on, please feel free to join us for that webinar. Holly, do you want to share a little bit about?
I just wanted to say it's on January 25th and they're going to be giving a full tour of it. And earlier when you said about flexibility, what's really, really beautiful about the app is that you can literally type into it frogs, for example. I love using the example of frogs. Say you have kids and they're all of a sudden they're interested in frogs. Maybe it's after a heavy rain and they're out in full force. And not only can you supplement whatever you're already doing with ready-made curriculum, you can then share it with other teachers or other youth development workers that you're with, and you can also provide links to send it home with families. So it's beautiful. So shameless plug, January 25th, right here on our Zoom channel, we'll be hosting Mizzen and having a full exploration of that app. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly. And if frogs are out in full force, I will not be out. That is like maybe my worst nightmare, just to share with the group. So we talked about designing your own curriculum, right? And so all throughout this process, we've been really talking about, okay, so we have this logic model, we're trying to meet this goal. We are trying to then measure, is our intervention or the curriculum that we've designed effective at achieving our outcome? So how do you do that, right? And so there's different ways to assess your activity, to assess a curricula, to assess an intervention, right? And so when we look at those types, those typical, and these are kind of common terms used in the field, but there's a couple of different, I'm going to say types of assessments, and they're on the screen here, and we're going to go through them. So we have placement assessments, right? And the name kind of gives it away, but it's typically an evaluation or assessment that's used, right, to place a student at a certain level, to understand their baseline, right? Oftentimes, it's referred to as a pre-assessment. So where are they when they came to your program? That's a really good way to understand what interventions youth might need, right? So when we think about it from an academic perspective, right, or even maybe from like a fun, hands-on and engaging project-based learning perspective, when we're looking at those placement evaluations or assessments, what we're really talking about is where are they right now, and it's typically compared to their peers, right, to their what is their norm. So when we're looking at these, there's a lot of examples of assessments that have, of curriculum that have placement components built into them. And for those of you who might be familiar with what your local school district is doing, one that's commonly used is iReady, and that has a placement component, right? Where students take like a fun and engaging quiz that then tells you where they are at their level for reading or math, right? So that's a really good example, a quick example that y'all might be familiar with of a placement type exam. Another one is if we think to the school day, right? And our progress monitoring tools that we're moving toward, that initial, kind of Q1 assessment that students are doing in the school day gives the teachers the information that they have and acts as their pre-assessment, right? So that we can establish that baseline so we know how to move forward and what interventions are needed. We also have formative assessments. And so formative assessments are typically carried out over the course of time. They're content specific. They can take the form of a diagnostic test, a standardized test, a quiz, or exam, but they're typically aiming to see if a student understands the work, right? The coursework, the lesson, what has been presented to them. So I like to think back, not to date myself, but I like to think back to like when you're like, I like to think back to elementary school and you do a chapter. And then at the end of the chapter, there's a chapter test, right? That's a really good, like simple example of a formative assessment. And then we have a summative assessment, right? And so you might have your summative assessment and they can be different. Sometimes they can be a test, or it can be a project or a paper, right? A written summative assessment. And it's typically carried out at the end of a course or at the end of a semester. And the purpose of that summative is to see what has the student retained kind of all along, right? What did they learn throughout this entire process? And it's less about measuring kind of one specific chapter or skill, if you think of it in those terms, and more about how much knowledge was grasped overall. And so when we look at those summative assessments, like I said, those are typically done at the end, and there are many different examples of summative assessments. The one that comes to mind is if you all remember back to maybe college or a high school class where you had to write that big paper at the end of the semester, right? Summative assessment. And so it doesn't mean that we have to ask for big papers at the end, or big projects or big exams, That's just a typical kind of use for summative. And then we have performance-based assessments, and sometimes these are standards-based. They oftentimes align with a specific outcome or a specific instruction, right? And we're really looking at proficiency in this space. And so oftentimes performance-based assessments, we do see them in a little bit of the arts space, right? When we're talking about kind of mastering something, but that doesn't mean that they can't be used in the academic space either. And so the example I like to use here is when we're talking about performance-based assessment, you might have a dance program that culminates in a showcase or a large performance. So I like to think like, you know, oftentimes we see the kiddos in their after-school dance programs that culminate in a winter festival, winter showcase, and everyone's dressed up doing the Nutcracker, right? That could be a performance-based assessment. And so when we're looking at these different types of assessments, I really think it's important to note that sometimes they can be exclusive of each other and sometimes they're not exclusive of each other, right? You could have a formative type assessment that acts as your placement assessment, or you could have a formative assessment that acts as your post to your placement, right? So what does that look like? But what's really important to look at when we're thinking of assessment and the considerations we want to make is this kind of like spectrum here. And so when we're looking at assessments, we want to talk about, are they formal or are they informal? So when you're thinking of maybe building your own or selecting your own, right? So formal assessments are typically documented, right? They're written. It implies that you're going to get a product, a physical, tangible back with some results. Can be a test or a quiz. I think the term written we use interchangeably, right? We know a lot of tests and quizzes happen online these days, but the idea is that there is some kind of documented evidence that an outcome occurred or that there is a result, right? Whereas informal assessments are typically less structured and can be more casual. They oftentimes may include things like observations, inventories, checklists, performances, or even participation or self-evaluation, right? And then when we look at, so kind of informal versus formal, and then we're going to go horizontally on the page, objective versus subjective. And so when we're looking at objective assessments, right, this is a form of questioning that typically only has one correct answer, right? So when we think about these types of questions, we're talking about true false statements, we're talking about multiple choice, or even matching responses and matching questions. It's not implied that there is another answer that can be correct. And which is kind of different from subjective assessments, which is a form of questioning that oftentimes can lead to more than one correct answer, right? And subjective questions, they typically are kind of extended response questions and or essay questions. And so when we're looking at those assessment types, right, it's really important to think about what it is you are trying to measure so that you can find an assessment that meets your needs, but also that will be easily understood by your students. And I like to use the example here of, you know, we're asking kids, you might be asking them questions. And do you want, is this really the opportunity to ask them the complex question, right? That they might get lost. And we're not trying to trick them, right? This is not like, you know, if, then, but, and, comma, sometimes, right? When we see those clauses in question, they're typically not straightforward. It's like, well, do you like this presentation? And did you think the presenter did a good job? Right? Those are two different questions. And can you really measure one and the other at the same time? In an ideal world, you like this presentation and you like me as a presenter, and so you put yes to the question, right? But you might live in a space where maybe you didn't like the presentation, but you like the presenter. And so you're like a no, yes. Is that going to lead the right outcome or results that we're trying to assess by asking that question, right? And so it's really important to think about that as we're kind of moving through this space. So there's some tips for designing your own assessment. So like if the curriculum that you've found or you're using does not come with an assessment, or you've developed your own curriculum and now you're like, okay, well, I can't find an assessment tool that aligns with what it is that we're actually doing in our program, you do have the option for creating your own. And it's important that when you're creating your own, that you really look at those goals that your program has, but also the goals of your, I'm going to say your curricula, your lessons, right? So we know in the after school space that oftentimes we do many different things, right? So you might have a STEM component, but you might also have an arts component. Is there one assessment for both? Do you want to design one assessment for both? Is it a better use of your time and resources to design a STEM one and then design an arts one, right? And what does that look like? And so it's really important that when we're thinking through this process of building your own, that we're designing the assessments that really measure that learning gain and that intended outcome. And sometimes that means we don't try to measure all of the learning gains at the same time, right? Because let's think about this after school space. Do we really want to sit kids down for a 40-question assessment? Probably not, right? And so how can we put in kind of checkpoints all throughout that will work towards measuring these learning gains? There are many ways that you can do this, and you really have to determine what's best for your program. We did include here some resources that are helpful for y'all to look at when creating your own assessments or when designing some curriculum. But I think what's really important to know in this space is when you design your own, you kind of want to keep it simple, right? And so we don't want to overtest kids. We don't want to overburden them and create this, and I'm going to say not create, I'm going to say take away from this safe space that is the after school program, right? And so if youth start to feel that, you know, gosh, this is really like, I'm taking a lot of tests after 3 o'clock, and I don't know that I really like this anymore. And do I want to keep coming to that program, right? This is like a lot like the regular school day, and it's no longer fun for me. So those are all real important things to consider when you're designing your assessments, right? So consider the length of the assessment, the type of assessment you're using, and how frequently you're using it. A real simple example of a way to measure learning gains is a pre and post test, right? So we think about it as you start with a pre to establish a baseline, you apply your intervention, and then at the end, you test if your intervention is effective by offering the same pre-assessment to see if responses have changed, if learning has occurred, if new skills have been acquired. So that is kind of the simplest way to put it in very easy terms when designing it, but it really comes down to what questions are you asking in that pre-post space. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more, and we're actually going to practice. So I've put 2 resources on this slide. We're going to walk through some examples of how to do this using kind of research informed practices is what I'm going to say, and best practices tailored to 2 different domains. So I just want to, I invite you guys to come off mute. I hope that you'll chat with me in this space, but so our first one and taking a look at it. So we have an arts standard here. And so for those of us who might not be super familiar, but like these are Florida standards, Florida's best standards, which the link to the best standards was on the previous site, as well as a link to CPALMS in our state. If you're not familiar with CPALMS, it is like a live version of the standards where you can like click in and look at standards and benchmarks by grade level, as opposed to, I think the DOE does have them available, but it's like a large PDF document. So 2 different ways to see the same information. But this visual arts standard, when we're looking at standards, there's a couple of different things to know, right? So the standard is our intended outcome, what we're trying to achieve in this case. And so when we look at the standard, the 4 that's in the standard, so the second number is typically the grade level, right? So this is a 4th grade standard. And so, you know, the overall, we're looking at the arts are inherently experiential and actively engaging learners in the process of creating, interpreting, and responding to art. But the benchmark that we're looking at is can the youth create artwork that communicates awareness of self, right? And so maybe the activity that we're doing here is we talk about artists at large, right? In the arts program, we talk about who are like some famous artists perhaps that might interest the youth. And then we talk about the fact that most artists at some point in their career develop a self-portrait, right? And so let's talk about what do you see yourself as, right? And then you might do a lesson around self-identity and then ask students to paint a portrait of themselves, right? And maybe it's an activity that lasts, gosh, a couple of days. Maybe it's a one and done. We mastered, we learned how to draw ears. Now I want you to take a second and learn and draw your own ears, right? Go ahead and do a self-portrait, from the shoulders up and practice drawing your ears. Well, when we talk about this activity, what is an assessment that we can use? How do we know, right, if youth mastered that skill? And so it might be a portfolio that we put together over the course of the semester that includes the self-portrait. And that would be an example of like an informal performance-based assessment, right? And so when we think about arts in this space, how do we really measure learning gains, right? Now it's different if we're talking about, I would say, art history, right? So I mentioned we did a lesson, we included in our lesson, the top famous 5 painters in history and like the name, or maybe 5 painters and the names of their work, right? So if that's a different route, if we're trying to measure what is their knowledge on art history, then our assessment might look different in this space. So I'm going to ask, like, if you all want to come off mute, is there another way we can assess this activity to measure the intended outcome? You guys want to do a different one together and then maybe we'll come off mute? I promise I don't bite. I'm just going to say that. We'll do one more. So we're looking at physical activity, right? Oh, so thank you, Kay, for answering in the chat. So we have observation, right? So observation is a way to measure for the arts activity. So let's shift to physical activity, right? So a lot of programs oftentimes talk about physical activity or fitness. And so we know for 3rd graders, the standard is that they demonstrate competency in many and proficiency in few movements from a variety of categories. And the specific benchmark that we're looking at here is that they strike a stationary object from a stationary position using body parts so that the object travels in the intended direction, right? So maybe it's a basketball game, your activity is a basketball game or a playoff. Maybe it's kickball. Maybe it's baseball. What does that activity look like, right? I'm not a sports person and I don't pretend to know everything about sports. So whatever that activity looks like, that physical activity that you're going to do, maybe it's through your basketball game, right? Or a playoff series. But your assessment could be observing the students, maybe passing the ball from one player to another when you practice your skills in preparation for that basketball game. And you document the number of times that a student can complete a pass to a particular player. Or how many times, when we think about, like, I don't know, the one sport I did do was kickball as a child. I played a lot of kickball. When I think about kickball, we would practice our kicks to see, could you kick the ball between the first and second base? Could you kick the ball between the second and the third base? And could you kick it way out in the outfield, right? And that's how you determine who your kickers were. And your stronger kickers, and that helped you determine your lineup if you were competing, right? And so when we think about an assessment for this benchmark, observation is a great tool to use in this case, right? Because we're observing, can the student, move the stationary object using a body part and have it travel in that intended direction. So if I say, Holly, don't move, pass me the ball. Can Holly pass me the ball? Does it make it to me? Right? So that's really what we're looking at and talking about in this assessment, in this space. And can we observe that? How many times can Holly pass Lily the ball? Or if I ask Holly to pass the ball to Tasha, can Holly pass the ball to Tasha? And can we change that direction for the intended direction? Like change the course of the direction to a new intended direction? And how many times can that be completed? And so when we think about physical activity, It's not just can they play a sport, right? There are benchmarks and standards that exist around what's the typical expectation for youth in that space. Okay, now I'm going to ask us this is like a discussion, maybe a tricky question. So what happens when we're using the arts as a mean to develop something else, right? So we might be having, and oftentimes we know, right? We talk a lot about out of school time programs. We talked about the quality indicators, and we talked about that we know that what really makes a difference is that program quality, not necessarily what the programming is or the activity is, but the quality of the overall program. So what happens if you're using an arts program, but you're trying to prove that your arts program also talks about mental health or well-being or resiliency, right? How do you measure that? What is your intended outcome, right? Using art to develop something else. And so I think that's really important for us to look at in this space, because we tend to say things like youth who participate, we as a field tend to say things like youth that participate in out of school time programs perform better academically, right? But an out of school time program doesn't mean that that youth is participating in a tutoring program. It could mean that they are participating in an art program or in a dance program or in a music program, right? And what does that look like when we talk about measuring kind of those intended outcomes? And I know oftentimes in working with providers, we see a lot of providers that say, we're a STEM program, but through STEM, we also promote well-being and sense of identity, right? A youth sense of identity. Well, how do you measure that? Right? So when we're talking about using our activity, it's really important that that intended outcome that we're talking about is captured. And it's okay if the activity is an art lesson on self-portraits, right? Because what we're asking youth to do is to really reflect on themselves and then to communicate how they see themselves through art. And so what's the skill then that we're trying to measure here? What's that interpersonal skill? So I leave you with this as you're designing your resiliency. Thank you. Yeah, so it might be resiliency that we're trying to measure, right? So in that space of resiliency, we're looking at, or their emotions, right? We're trying to measure how they perceive themselves. Those are all great answers. Thank you all in the chat. But when we're looking at setting up your assessment, is the assessment really then about the self-portrait? Is it about can they draw an ear? No, right? So then it's important for us to tweak our assessment to truly measure, to truly try to capture what it is that we're trying to measure. And so those are kind of our examples. I know we're like 30 seconds left before 11. So I just want to leave you all with this concept of what is high quality. And so when we look at high quality, we spent a lot of time today talking about assessment, but really we were only looking at assessing one component here, right? That in quality instruction is what we were looking at. How do we measure that the quality instruction we're providing is yielding the intended outcome, right? Are youth learning? When we really think of quality, it's important to note that there's all these other factors that go into it. And how do we measure those other factors to see if they are also effective and contributing to our quality? And so I'll leave you with, this is something that Florida After School is here for. And what we aim to do with the programs that we work with is support them in this space and in this journey of either expanding their existing quality or achieving that high quality. And so we do have a set of standards that are on our website. And this upcoming year, we will be publishing our self-assessment tool. So Florida's self-assessment tool that looks at allowing programs to rate themselves in these quality indicators to really work to define what does that high quality look like, and where if improvements can be made, where can they be made? And so I do invite you all to, I thank you for your time today, and I invite you all to sign up for our newsletter. as a way to stay connected and to keep getting information on our upcoming webinars and our tools and resources as we launch and develop them. And I'll leave you with this in summary. Think about this as a way to tell your story. So we collect data and evaluation. We do this process, we design our outcomes and we look for what our intended outcomes are, we design our activities, and we do all of this in the field to tell a story, right? Because without this data, we can't tell folks, are we effective? How do you ask for money when you don't have the proof that what you're doing makes a difference, right? So think about that as we move forward. I mean, folks are more likely to fund you if you can say, this is how we measure what we do. This is how I can tell the story of Becky, who came in as a 3rd grader on a 1st grade reading level, but participated in our program. And now she's participated all year long and she's left at a 4th grade reading level, right? How do we measure that outcome and put a name to that story? And it starts with this data collection and evaluation space, right? And then it talks about that also, not just talks about Becky's success, but also the effectiveness of your program overall. So I leave you with those parting words and I thank you for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lily, for walking us through that. We have dropped a link in the chat to carry through with this idea of summative evaluation or feedback and a quick quiz and survey. So please take just a quick moment to click on that link and give us and our speaker feedback on the content from today and all of that. For those of you who said the QR code link isn't working, we'll send you a special invite link to join the newsletter. Promise you that you'll receive that. I also just want to take a quick moment for those of you who are located. I saw a couple, and I'm going to take a point of privilege and put on my Leon County specific hat to let you know that one of your local funding agencies, either through the school district or the Children's Services Council, is already partnered with Florida After School and will be making even more resources available in your community. Same thing, I know we're working with Alachua County and Escambia County and Jacksonville, so please make sure that you sign up for that newsletter and we will definitely follow up with a reminder link for that. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions, our team will hang out for just a few minutes and we'd be happy to answer those.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, hi, Tim.
Hey, how are you guys? I just wanted to I put it in the chat, but will you be sharing the links and the slides by email so I can share it with my team?
Yes, ma'am. The link will be posted on the Florida After School YouTube page later today, and all of the links will be with that. So we will not only send you a link directly to the website or to the recording, but you'll get all the links for all of the items.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Of course. Any other questions?